Well, leaders, welcome back as we jump into lesson 9. We are getting incredibly close to the finish line and getting through the book. So we're excited to jump into lesson 9 on chapter 13. And what you're going to find as we kind of jump in is, especially compared to some of the previous lessons, this is a little more simple, a little more straightforward. And so much so, we would really encourage you guys as you kind of go through this lesson to kind of keep the study portion much tighter, much quicker, because we think some of the best out of this lesson is going to come in the back end when we kind of talk about not so much what is love and studying love, but actually how do we put love into practice. And so we really would exhort you guys as you're leading through this lesson to make sure the majority of time you spend way more on the back end of how to apply this than necessarily what does it mean.
Yeah, totally. So in that regard, we would just encourage you to jump into the text. It's the entire chapter 13. You might have somebody read it or even throw out a question, hey, was this read at your wedding or whatever?
Absolutely.
But yeah, some of the observation questions could be good also to get the discussion going. Keywords and themes. What you'll notice in the first few verses is that the spiritual gifts are kind of rehearsed and renewed again. He's saying how love impacts each of one of the gifts that he had talked about in 12. Some of the contrasts are partial and full, child and man. So yeah, some of those things. Question 2 is really great, listing the characteristics of love in this passage. And a way we talked about maybe doing that is to just put a couple of categories in there, like what it is and what it is not, what it does and what it does not do. So that might be a way to, talk about that. And then one other question you might throw out here is just to ask your group, hey, could you in one sentence or phrase even answer what is love after you've studied all of this? And I think that would be another great way to kind of get into the text.
Love that. As you kind of jump into the interpretation, honestly, for me, thinking through this chapter as it kind of falls right between chapters 12 and 14, it's not just inspiring. For me, honestly, personally, it's pretty convicting. Yeah. So I can be a pretty skill-driven person, a little bit too much focus on competency. And ultimately what Paul is doing for the church here and ultimately for us is helping us kind of get back to what's the motive behind all these gifts that we've been talking about. And so ultimately what he'll do here and kind of putting chapter 13 right between 12 and 14 that we looked at last week is to make sure there's the priority of love over and above the gifts themselves. So why are we having these gifts? Why are we deploying them? It's primarily because of love. And that really isn't just a piece of this discussion about gifts. That's really a thread that he's been weaving throughout this whole book. Mm-hmm. And so as the Corinthians kind of think through what does it mean to be spiritual, or we might ask or say it, what does it mean to be mature? They're going to run to a series of different answers. And what Paul seems to do over and over again is to say, actually, not so much what you think, but actually it's back to the centrality of love. If you have the gifts, but you don't have love, then you're nothing more than a gong or a cymbal that's noisy and chaotic, but not purposeful and actually impactful. And so ultimately he'll bring us back to this idea of love as really the driving force behind these gifts that he's been talking about both before this chapter and then after this chapter.
Yeah, so good. And then question 2 kind of broadens it out to kind of the teaching of the whole Bible, actually. What is the driving force for all that we do in our lives is the great commandment here. So it might be a great time to have your people look these up, read them out loud. So yeah, why is love more valuable? Because it is the greatest commandment. It intersects, our response to God and response to people, loving God and loving neighbor. Also, you could even say in 1 John 4 that God is love. It's a characteristic of a mature believer because that's the God we're imaging. I think that's a good, segue into the next part.
I love question 3 because as you talk about question 2, I think question 3 kind of gets us to, well, what's the scope of that command or where all is that upon us? And so as you kind of look through those verses, kind of how do you see different groups that it applies to for us?
So this again is another, broadening it out beyond what the Corinthians were dealing with even, and saying, reminding them there are believers and unbelievers that come into their midst. And so showing love in their gifts and in what they're doing is critical. So that's 14, 22 through 25. And then we brought in here the story of the Good Samaritan, which is another great reminder. If we're supposed to love our neighbor, who is our neighbor? And again, it's the unexpected one, that the outsider is normally the one that Jesus is the one who is saying, hey, that's the one we need to bring in. The other thing you could bring in here is Matthew 5:43 through 45. We don't have it here, but it's also a scope of love, which is not only to love each other, but to love our enemies. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, you've heard it said, that you should love one another. Well, also to love your enemies. So I think all of those are good reminders.
Question 4, and kind of as it looks at verses 9 to 12, I think sets up almost a preview of what he's going to spend an entire chapter on in chapter 15. Yeah. So he's going to kind of fast forward or flash forward, if you will, as to what the future will be. And part of what he's going to try to make the point is the spiritual gifts that he's been talking about in chapters 12 and 14 are for the here and the now. They're for that phase in time in which we're becoming more and more like Jesus, that we're waiting to see Jesus face to face. And so those gifts get us to that moment. But once we see Jesus face to face, once we're in that future that is to come and the renewal of all things, then these gifts are no longer going to be necessary. And so he's going to make the argument, why have we placed these gifts over love if love is what's going to remain both impactful now and even in the future, and those gifts go away. And so that old section also will kind of really set up a broader discussion in chapter 15 about the resurrection and about the future as well.
Yeah, so good.
So when I was in college, Carolyn, I had a series of friends that were going to go work out, and they said, hey, we're going to spend a couple hours working out. And what ended up happening to them was they spent a couple hours researching workouts, but they didn't actually work out. Yeah. And so part of what we want to do in this section as we think about application and even the engage section is make sure we haven't spent 2 hours in a Bible study studying about love and not actually making some steps that we're actually going to go do this. And so help us kind of think through as you think about this section and kind of some takeaways for our groups. Where would you encourage leaders to take their groups?
Yeah. I think if I were leading a group, I would do one or maybe one of the application questions, the one that resonates most with you. Maybe the one about how biblical love is a contrast to cultural love. But don't spend too much time on there, because actually what we're going to suggest is we have our Engage tool here about sharing the gospel, but we would like to broaden that out and actually encourage you as a group leader to think about that story of the Good Samaritan in a way. Like, who are the neighbors around you and your group that you could actually practice showing love to? That could start out by identifying needs in your group. Who are the people in the concentric circles out from your group, maybe someone in your group that has some needs that you could meet to show love together. And we also have community partners. So Trey, tell us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. No matter what campus you're at here at Grace Bible Church, each of our campuses have selected 2 or 3 key strategic community partners that they want to not just feature at their campus, but they're also trying to help mobilize students, kids, parents, families, college students to get involved, to not just see what's happening in the community, but ultimately to be changed and challenged to actually go and invest. And so one of the things that we would encourage you to do, whatever campus you're at, is to talk to the staff there and to get a sense of what are the community partners that they're kind of focusing in on, and what are the opportunities that exist. We're headed toward the end of a semester, a great time, especially with the holidays coming, to serve and to mobilize your group. And so we've said this a lot with the Engage tools, but ultimately we're not necessarily trying to get these to be individual sports, something that we just do as an individual, but we're ultimately trying to make this a group sport. So whether it's evangelism, or in this case, as we're talking about kind of serving with community partners, it's something our whole group can do. It's also something, in a sense, a whole family can do as well. And so one of the things I love, Carolyn, I know your heartbeat, and I know kind of not just that this is a passion for you, but I also know that you serve on the board for the B Community, one of our community partners that Southwood has adopted. And so I'm curious, as you not just kind of have your church hat, but even as a board member for a community partner organization, what are the opportunities that exist? What have you seen that's been impactful? What would you kind of give a suggestion to our leaders as they think about it?
Yeah, so kind of putting my hat on as a nonprofit board member, I think the biggest thing from that side of the table is to know that people care about what you're doing that's extra to a typical thing. And I think the each individual nonprofit or community partner has has its own needs and its own kind of system. But at the B community, we're all about relationships. And so I think one of the best things about partnering with a community partner is that it's a way for mutual relationships to happen. It's not like people coming in and just a drop in, but to form long-lasting relationships with people who are serving in a unique way. And so to feel that support from a church group. So at B, we've had lots of people from staff to home groups to just even businesses in our community come and learn a little bit more about what we're doing and then roll up their sleeves. We have cleaning projects. We have getting ready for events. We have one time. We have long term. There are so many needs in every community partner that you and your group or individual families can find something that they can do. And just knowing that the way it's being received is like someone sees what we're doing, someone cares about what we're doing, and we feel supported by it. So it's awesome.
One of the things we talk a lot about is that we want to be witnesses of the gospel where we live, work, and play. And so I think about my life and my neighborhood, my kids' schools, and their hobbies often is where my time goes. Yeah. And 90% of my life is where I live, work, and play, or where my kids play at least. And so one of the things I appreciate about our community partners is they help us get into spaces and relationships that are beyond where we live, work, and play, which can often be 95% of our life. And we often get inward focused and we don't see the community. And so I'm grateful that our community partners are invested in spaces to not just be in the community, but to be for the community and ultimately opening up opportunities for us to get engaged and to get to be a part of what's happening, to have our eyes broadened, but also even more so to have our relationships expanded. And so we would just encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities. Our campuses are trying to put those in front of each of you every single semester. And so you're going to hopefully have already hearing about them. And so we would love to just kind of give you a nudge to say, jump in this holiday season and figure out how you guys can serve even as a group.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, we're praying for you guys. Thanks.
See ya.